The scent I remember most is lemon oil and old wood. It was my father's scent, the perfume of our legacy, steeped into the very grain of the workshop floor at Vance & Co. Legacy Instruments. He used to say you could tell the quality of a violin not just by its sound, but by its smell. The resinous tang of spruce, the sweet, deep notes of maple, and the faint, citrusy ghost of the polish he applied with his own hands. He taught me how to listen to the wood, to feel its hum beneath my fingertips before it ever held a tune. I was his shadow, his apprentice, his Ellie. From the time I could barely see over the workbench, my world was shaped by the graceful curves of a cello, the delicate arch of a violin's neck, and the resonant soul of handcrafted instruments that bore our family name. Vance & Co. wasn't just a business. It was a cathedral of sound, built by my grandfather and perfected by my father, Richard Vance. He wasn't a businessman. He was an artist whose medium was commerce. Every decision he made was guided by a single principle: to create and preserve beauty. He knew our clients by name, knew the specific timbre they sought, the exact weight and balance they needed from their bow. He'd spend hours with a musician, not selling, but communing, helping them find the instrument that was already a part of their soul. I inherited his passion, his eye for detail, and his unwavering belief that our work mattered. I spent my 20s learning every facet of the company, from sourcing rare tonewoods in the forests of Italy to managing the delicate egos of our master luthiers. By 30, I was his right hand, his named successor. The board, which consisted of my father, his younger brother Arthur, and 2 long-standing family friends, had already voted on it. My future was as solid and beautifully finished as one of our concert grands. Then one Tuesday in April, the world stopped humming. A heart attack, swift and merciless. One moment my father was laughing on the phone with me, debating the merits of a new varnish formula. The next, he was gone. The silence he left behind was a deafening physical void. The workshop smelled wrong, the wood felt mute beneath my touch. Grief was a suffocating cloak, heavy and blinding. The funeral was a blur of black suits, hollow condolences, and the pained, pitying glances of people who knew I'd lost not just a father, but my compass, my champion, my entire world. My uncle Arthur delivered a eulogy that was more about the enduring strength of the Vance & Co. brand than the man who built it. My cousin Leo, Arthur's son, stood beside him, a portrait of feigned solemnity, his eyes already calculating. My stepmother, Catherine, my father's wife of 5 years, clung to my arm, her grief genuine but laced with a palpable thread of anxiety for her own future. She was a kind woman, but not a strong one, a decorative addition to my father's life rather than a partner in it. I felt a terrible, lonely responsibility for them all. The first few weeks were a disorienting fog. I tried to throw myself into the work, finding solace in the familiar routines my father had taught me. I thought that by keeping his creation alive, I was keeping a part of him with me. Arthur, now the interim CEO, initially let me be. He'd pat my shoulder and say, "Take all the time you need, Ellie. We'll keep the ship afloat." Leo would offer to take meetings for me, framing it as a favor. "You focus on grieving, cousin. I've got this." I was too shattered to see the web being woven around me. I saw their actions through the distorted lens of my own sorrow, mistaking opportunism for support. The shift was subtle at first, a decision made without my input, a key client meeting I wasn't invited to, a financial report I had to request 3 times before Leo's assistant finally sent over a heavily redacted version. When I questioned it, Arthur would give me a sad, fatherly smile. "We're just trying to lighten your load, my dear. Your father's passing, it's a tremendous shock. You're not thinking clearly." The words were always couched in concern, but the implication was a sharp, cold jab. You are emotional, you are unstable, you are a liability. It was the oldest trick in the book, a weapon polished smooth by generations of men who wanted to sideline a competent woman. They were using my grief against me, turning my love for my father into a disqualification. The final, fatal blow came a month after the funeral. Arthur called a family meeting in the main boardroom. The room, with its grand mahogany table and wall of windows overlooking the city, had always felt like a sanctuary to me. It was where my father and I had mapped out our dreams for the company. That day, it felt like an execution chamber. I walked in to find Arthur at the head of the table, in my father's chair. Leo was on his right, looking smug. Catherine was on his left, her gaze fixed on her tightly clasped hands. The two other board members, old friends of my father, were conspicuously absent. "Thank you for coming, Ellie," Arthur began, his voice oozing a practiced sincerity that made my skin crawl. "We need to discuss the future of Vance & Co. and your role in it." I sat down, my spine straight. "My role is clear, Arthur. I'm the successor. Dad made that plain for years." Arthur exchanged a look with Leo. "Your father's wishes were, of course, paramount to him, but he was a man led by his heart, and his heart was with you. Unfortunately, a business of this magnitude cannot be run by heart alone." The condescension was suffocating. "I have a business degree from Wharton," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I've managed our international supply chain for 8 years. I personally negotiated the partnership with the London Symphony. My heart seems to have done quite well for this company." Leo scoffed, a small, ugly sound. "Come on, Ellie. Everyone knows Richard held your hand through all of that. We need a firm, decisive leader now, someone who won't be compromised by emotion during this difficult time." The insult was so profound, so dismissive of every late night, every sacrifice, every ounce of passion I had poured into our shared work, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. They were erasing me from my own life story. I looked at Catherine, a silent plea in my eyes. "You knew him, you know what he wanted." She finally looked up, her expression a miserable cocktail of guilt and self-preservation. "Ellie, dear," she whispered, "perhaps it's for the best. The stress, it would be too much for you right now. Your father would have wanted you to be taken care of, not burdened with all this." Taken care of. The words hung in the air, reducing me to a fragile doll, a problem to be managed with a trust fund and a pat on the head. Arthur leaned forward, his hands steepled. He was enjoying this. "We've had an emergency board meeting. Leo and I, with Catherine's proxy vote, have decided on a new leadership structure. I will be staying on as CEO, and Leo will be promoted to Chief Operating Officer." He slid a leather-bound folder across the table. "This is a generous severance package. It includes your father's shares, which will be bought out at a fair market value, and a substantial monthly stipend. In return, we require you to sign a non-compete and non-disclosure agreement. You will, of course, have no further role at Vance & Co." I didn't open the folder. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold numbness spreading through my limbs. I looked from my uncle's triumphant face to my cousin's arrogant smirk, to my stepmother's downcast eyes. These were the people my father had trusted. This was my family. "You're firing me," I said, the words tasting like ash. "From my own company." "We're protecting the company," Arthur corrected smoothly. "And we're protecting you from yourself. You're not in a fit state to run a lemonade stand, let alone a multi-million-dollar corporation. Be sensible, Ellie. Take the money. Go travel. Grieve properly. It's what's best for everyone." The finality in his tone was absolute. There was no appeal, no negotiation. I had been outmaneuvered, disowned, and discarded. My father's death hadn't just broken my heart, it had left me vulnerable to the wolves he had mistaken for family. I stood up, my legs trembling but holding. I didn't look at the folder. I didn't look at Catherine again. I held Arthur's gaze, pouring every ounce of my shock, my pain, and a nascent, terrifying rage into it. "You will regret this," I said, my voice a low, guttural promise that seemed to come from someone else, a harder, colder version of myself I hadn't yet met. Arthur simply smiled. "I doubt that very much. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings." I didn't need an escort. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, each step an act of supreme self-control. I walked past the portraits of my grandfather and my father in the hallway, their painted eyes seeming to follow me with sorrow and disbelief. I walked through the main showroom, the beautiful instruments gleaming under the soft lights, each one a testament to a legacy I was no longer a part of. When I reached the great glass doors at the front of the building, I pushed one open and stepped out into the chilly April air. The door swung shut behind me with a soft, definitive click, the sound of my life being severed in two. I stood on the pavement, the city's noise a dull roar in my ears, and stared up at the 7 stories of brick and glass that housed everything I had ever known and loved. They had taken my father. They had taken his life's work. They had kicked me out into the cold. And as I stood there, shattered and alone, a tiny ice-cold ember of an idea began to glow in the deepest, most devastated part of my soul. They had taken the business, but I knew something they didn't. I knew who my father had left the building to. The first week was a study in phantom limbs. I'd wake in the pre-dawn darkness, my mind already troubleshooting a humidity issue in the cello room, and my hand would reach for the work phone that was no longer on my nightstand. I'd walk past a music store and my feet would instinctively slow, my brain starting to critique the window display before I remembered it was no longer my concern. My life's purpose had been amputated, leaving a raw, aching nerve that twitched with the memory of what I'd lost. The silence in my apartment was absolute. It was the inverse of the workshop, which was never truly quiet. Even at night, you could feel the building breathe, the wood settling, the ghosts of 1,000 melodies hanging in the air. Here, there was only the sterile hum of the refrigerator and the mocking presence of the severance folder Arthur had sent by messenger. It lay on my coffee table like a tombstone, unopened. I refused to give them the satisfaction of my signature. I tried to fight. My first calls were to Marcus and Julian, the other 2 board members, my father's supposed friends. Marcus, a man who had held me as a baby, was suddenly impossible to reach. His secretary informed me with strained politeness that he was traveling indefinitely. Julian answered his phone but sounded distant and uncomfortable. "My hands are tied, Ellie," he'd said, his voice thin with apology. "Arthur and Leo, they leveraged Catherine's shares. It was a legal vote. I'm sorry. It's a deplorable way to treat Richard's daughter, but it's done." He wished me well and ended the call, leaving me with the cold, hard truth. Loyalty in their world was a currency, and mine had just been devalued to 0. The lawyer I consulted confirmed it. He was a sharp, expensive man in a glass tower overlooking Central Park, and he reviewed the company's bylaws with a clinical detachment. "The vote was valid," he concluded, steepling his fingers. "With Ms. Vance's proxy, your uncle secured a majority. It's brutal, but it's ironclad. You could sue, of course. Allege undue influence or emotional distress. It would be long, messy, and public. They would drag your name, your father's name, through the mud. And frankly, your chances of winning would be slim." He advised me to take the settlement, to sign the papers and walk away with my dignity and a small fortune. But what he didn't understand was that they had already taken my dignity. And the money felt like blood money, a payment for my silence, for my complicity in the desecration of my father's memory. So I did nothing. I let the days bleed into one another, fueled by too much wine and too little sleep. I was drowning in the dual tides of grief and rage. Some moments, the agony of my father's absence would hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me breathless and sobbing on the floor. In others, a white-hot fury would consume me. I'd picture Leo sitting in my office, his feet up on the desk I had shared with my father, making decisions he was too stupid and arrogant to understand. I'd imagine Arthur charming a client, spinning some lie about a new direction, while systematically dismantling the principles of quality and craftsmanship my father had spent a lifetime building. The helplessness was the worst part. It was a poison, seeping into every part of my being, telling me they had won. It was Catherine who, inadvertently, threw me a lifeline. She called 2 months after the coup, her voice a fragile, fluttering thing. "Ellie, darling, I hope I'm not disturbing you." I almost hung up. I was wondering if you might be able to go through your father's study. At the house. I haven't been able to bring myself to touch it, and the decorator is coming next week to turn it into a sitting room. The casual cruelty of that, erasing his sanctuary for a sitting room, was breathtaking. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her how she could betray him so completely. But a different instinct took over, a fierce, protective urge. That study was the last pure piece of him left. If I didn't save his things, they would be thrown out with the rest of his memory. "I'll be there Saturday," I said, my voice clipped and cold. Walking into my father's house was torture. Catherine gave me a brief, tearful hug before scurrying away, leaving me to face the ghost in the study. The room was exactly as he'd left it. A half-empty mug of coffee on the desk, a pair of reading glasses resting on an open book about Stradivarius. The air still held the faint scent of his pipe tobacco and old paper. It was an emotional minefield. Every book, every photograph, every scribbled note was a memory. I spent the first hour just sitting in his leather chair, weeping, letting the finality of it all wash over me. Then slowly, methodically, I began to pack. I sorted his life into cardboard boxes, books, papers, awards, personal correspondence. It was an intimate, heartbreaking archaeology. I found my clumsy, crayon-drawn cards from kindergarten and photos of us fishing at the lake. And in the bottom drawer of his large oak desk, beneath a stack of old blueprints for a concert hall he'd dreamed of funding, my fingers brushed against a small, false panel at the back. My heart gave a little jolt. It was a secret compartment he'd shown me as a child, a place where he kept his treasures. My hands trembled as I slid the panel open. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a polished rosewood box about the size of a book. It was intricately carved with musical notations from a Bach allemande, his favorite piece. It was locked. I searched the desk for a key, my pulse quickening. Taped to the underside of the main drawer, I found a small, ornate silver key. It fit the lock perfectly. With a soft click, the lid opened. I expected to find old love letters or a family heirloom. Instead, I found a single, thick file folder, tied with a blue ribbon. The label on the folder was typewritten and stark. The ALLEMNANDE holding CORP. My brow furrowed in confusion. I'd never heard of it. I untied the ribbon and opened the folder. The first document was the original deed to the 7-story building at 54th and Lexington, the Vance & Co. building. I scanned it quickly, my eyes searching for the owner's name. It wasn't Vance & Co., it wasn't Richard Vance. The owner was listed as the Allemande Holding Corp. Beneath it were the articles of incorporation for that very company, established 20 years ago. And under that, a notarized document from a law firm I didn't recognize, a private trust and estate specialist downtown. It was a declaration of trust, a meticulously crafted legal instrument. It stated that upon the death of the sole director, Richard Vance, the full ownership, directorship, and all assets of the Allemande Holding Corp. Were to be transferred immediately and irrevocably to a single beneficiary. My eyes scanned down the page, my breath catching in my throat. There in crisp, black ink was my name, Alara Marie Vance. My legs gave out and I sank to the floor, the papers clutched in my hand. It didn't make sense. And then, at the very bottom of the folder, I found a sealed envelope with a single word on it, Ellie. I tore it open. It was a letter in my father's familiar, elegant script. My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass. I am gone, and the wolves are at the door. I pray I am wrong, that this letter will gather dust for 50 years and you will find it as an old woman and have a good laugh at your father's paranoia. But I have seen the way my brother looks at what we've built. I have seen the avarice in his son's eyes. They see a machine that produces money. They do not see its soul. I have always known this, and I have tried to shield the business, and you, from their ambition. That is why, 20 years ago, I separated our two most important assets. Vance & Co. is the soul, the art, the music. But the building, our home, is the foundation. I used a portion of my personal inheritance, money that had nothing to do with the company, to create a separate holding corporation and purchase the building outright. The business, Vance & Co., has been a tenant ever since, paying rent to my holding company. A rent, I might add, that has been well below market rate for 2 decades. Arthur does not know this. He believes the building is a long-term lease asset held by the company. He is a sloppy man when it comes to details he finds boring. He never once asked to see the ownership papers. This building, Ellie, is now yours. It belongs to you and you alone. It is your fortress, your inheritance. It is the power I could not give you in a boardroom vote swayed by greed and weakness. They will have told you that you are too emotional, too soft, not strong enough to lead. Do not believe them. Your heart is your greatest strength. It is what connects you to the music, to the wood, to our clients. It is what makes you my daughter. Now you must find the steel that I know is wrapped around that heart. I don't know what you will do with this power. That is up to you. But know this, a violin is just wood and string until a true artist gives it a voice. You are the artist, Ellie. It is your turn to play. Make them hear you. All my love forever. Dad. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not the tears of a victim. They were tears of validation, of love, of a ferocious, burgeoning power. My father had seen it all. He had known. And he had left me not just a key, but a sword. I sat on the floor of his study for a long time, the letter in one hand and the deed in the other. The grief for my father was still there, a vast, aching canyon in my soul. But it was no longer a drowning pool. It was a reservoir of strength. The helplessness that had paralyzed me for 2 months evaporated like mist in a sudden, blazing sun. It was replaced by a purpose so clear, so cold, and so absolute that it made me shiver. I thought about the lease. My father had complained about it at dinner just before he died. "Arthur keeps forgetting the main building lease is up for renewal at the end of the year," he'd grumbled. "Have to get on that." The end of the year. That was less than 6 months away. I stood up and walked back to the desk. I carefully placed the documents and the letter back into the rosewood box. I would take this with me. This was my real inheritance. The rest of the items in the room, the memories, could be packed away. My focus was no longer on the past. When I got back to my apartment that night, I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the severance folder for the first time. I didn't open it. I walked it to the kitchen, dropped it into the metal trash can, and lit a match. I watched the thick, glossy paper curl and blacken, the words, "severance agreement," consumed by flames until they were nothing but gray ash. Then I picked up my phone. I didn't call the family lawyer. I didn't call my friends. I looked up the number for Massey, Thorne, and Black, the most ruthless real estate litigation firm in New York City. "Yes," I said to the operator, my voice steady and hard as granite. "I'd like to schedule a consultation with your senior partner. My name is Alara Vance, and I'm a landlord with a tenant problem." The offices of Massey, Thorne, and Black were located on the 58th floor of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds. The air inside was cool, still, and smelled faintly of money and merciless victory. It was a place designed to intimidate, from the silent, imposing receptionist to the vast windows offering a god's-eye view of the city below. I, however, was past the point of intimidation. I had spent the last 2 months in hell. This was just a change of scenery. Evelyn Reed was not what I expected. She wasn't a grizzled old man, but a woman perhaps a decade older than me, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a severe black dress that seemed woven from tailored shadow. She didn't offer condolences or platitudes. She listened, her face a mask of neutral concentration, as I laid out the entire story, from my father's death to the boardroom execution to the discovery in the rosewood box. I pushed the folder across her expansive glass desk. She opened it and began to read, her silence stretching for a full 10 minutes as she examined each document with a practiced, forensic gaze. When she finally looked up, the neutrality in her eyes had been replaced by a flicker of something else, professional appreciation. "This is exquisite," she said, her voice a low, precise murmur. "Your father was a very careful, very prescient man. The trust is ironclad. The holding corporation is a fortress. Ms. Vance, you don't just own the building. You own the ground beneath their feet, and they have absolutely no idea." "So I can do it?" I asked, the question hanging in the sterile air. "I can get them out." "Getting them out will be the easy part," she replied, a thin, dangerous smile touching her lips for the first time. "The lease agreement your father had with his own company is, frankly, a joke. It's a standard 5-year commercial lease with a 90-day notice clause for non-renewal. There are no special provisions, no options to buy, no first rights of refusal. It's the kind of lease you give to a pop-up t-shirt shop, not your flagship family business." He gave them sweetheart rent, but he never gave them an ounce of power. She leaned forward. "Our first step is simple. We do nothing. We wait. The lease expires on December 31st. 90 days prior to that is October 2nd. On that morning, we will have a notice of non-renewal delivered to your uncle's office by a process server. It will be a clean, legal, and undeniable declaration that as of January 1st, their tenancy is terminated." "They'll fight it," I said. "They'll claim it belongs to the business, that it's a family asset." "They will," Evelyn agreed, her eyes gleaming. "They will make a lot of noise. They will file motions. They will accuse you of being an emotional, hysterical woman taking advantage of a loophole. Their lawyers will try to bury us in paperwork. It will be my pleasure to disabuse them of these notions in court. Your father's foresight has given us an unassailable position. While they are fighting a war in the courts, the clock on their lease will keep ticking. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity, brutal in its execution. For the next 3 months, my life was transformed. The aimless, grief-stricken woman I had become was buried, and a new one was forged in the fire of legal strategy and cold, hard numbers. I operated like a spy, gathering intelligence for a war only I knew was coming. My first move was to secure my resources. Evelyn's services were not cheap, and I knew I needed a war chest. My father had left me a personal portfolio of stocks and a small collection of modern art, entirely separate from the business and Catherine's inheritance. I met with a financial advisor, a discreet woman Evelyn recommended, and gave the order to liquidate everything. The advisor raised an eyebrow. "This is a significant portfolio. Are you sure you want to turn it all to cash?" "I'm making a new investment," I told her, my voice betraying no emotion. "In real estate." I took the money and funneled it into a new account, one my family had no knowledge of. This was my operating budget. It paid for Evelyn's retainer, for the property assessors I hired to give me a new, aggressive valuation of the building, and for the commercial real estate consultant who educated me on market-rate rents in that specific, highly desirable block of Midtown Manhattan. The numbers he came back with were staggering. My father, in his generosity, had been leasing the building to Vance and Co. for roughly a third of its potential market value. The business wasn't just profitable, it had been secretly subsidized for 20 years. Arthur and Leo had no idea how good they had it. Their fat profit margins were built on a lie they didn't even know they were living. My days took on a new, rigorous rhythm. I woke at 5, went to the gym, and spent my days in a small, rented office cubicle downtown, surrounded by zoning maps, financial projections, and legal textbooks. I studied property law until my head ached. I learned about triple net leases, about eviction proceedings, about every tool of power a commercial landlord possessed. I stopped drinking wine at night and started drinking black coffee at dawn. I traded my soft, comfortable clothes for sharp, tailored armor, blazers, silk blouses, and heels that clicked with authority on the pavement. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the ghost of my grief in the shadows under my eyes, but I also saw a glint of steel that hadn't been there before. It was the look of a woman who had found a purpose. My purpose was singular, to dismantle the world of the men who had wronged me, using the very tools they respected, money, law, and absolute power. I wasn't just going to evict them. That was too simple, too quick. My plan was more methodical. I would let them see the guillotine being built. I would offer them a chance to survive that was, in fact, no chance at all. I would make them an offer for a new lease. A lease based on the new sky-high valuation, a lease at the full, unforgiving market rate, with clauses and conditions so strict it would feel like a straitjacket. I would give them the illusion of a choice, knowing full well they could never afford it. Their business, stripped of my father's quiet subsidy, could not survive the shock. I would force them to reject the deal, and then, only then, would I evict them for failure to secure a new lease. I wouldn't just be throwing them out. I would be legally proving they were incapable of running the business, without the foundation my father had secretly provided. The transformation was lonely. I cut myself off from old friends who might have ties to the family. I couldn't risk a single word of my new life getting back to Arthur or Catherine. My only confidant was Evelyn, who proved to be more than a lawyer. She was a general, a strategist who saw my cold fury not as a flaw, but as a valuable asset. "Most people in your position are driven by emotion," she told me during one of our late-night planning sessions. "They want a quick, bloody revenge. That's easy to fight. But you're detaching the anger from the action. You're building a machine, Ms. Vance. A legal, financial machine to take them apart piece by piece. It's far more effective and far more terrifying." I didn't feel terrifying. I felt focused. I felt like I was finally honoring my father. Not the gentle, loving man who taught me about wood and music, but the shrewd, protective man who had built a fortress for his daughter. I was finally picking up the weapon he had left me and learning how to wield it. Every paragraph of lease code I memorized, every dollar I moved into my war chest, felt like a promise I was keeping to him. I will make them hear me. The end of September arrived, bringing a crisp autumnal bite to the air. The final pieces of my plan were in place. I had my team. I had my funding. I had my strategy. The machine was built and ready to run. On the last day of the month, I stood in Evelyn Reed's office, looking out at the city skyline. The Vance & Co. building wasn't visible from here, but I could feel its presence, a beacon in the concrete canyons. It was my building, my foundation, my weapon. Evelyn stood beside me, holding a single, thick envelope. Inside was the notice of non-renewal, a declaration of war. "The server is scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow," she said quietly. "Once I give this to him, there is no turning back. Arthur will receive it by 9:05. "Are you absolutely certain, Alara?" She used my first name for the first time, and the sound of it was a quiet acknowledgement of the journey I had taken. I turned my head to look at my reflection in the vast window. The woman looking back was pale and serious, her eyes holding a weary but unbreakable resolve. She was a stranger, and she was myself. I thought of my father's kind face, of Arthur's smug smile, of the cold click of the glass door shutting behind me. I thought of the legacy they had tried to steal. I turned back to Evelyn, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was a smile she mirrored perfectly. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady as a perfect, ringing note. "I'm certain. Let's begin." The morning of October 2nd was unnaturally bright. From my small office window, I watched the sun glint off the glass skins of distant skyscrapers. I had been there since dawn, a thermos of black coffee my only companion. I wasn't reviewing documents or preparing for a meeting. I was simply waiting. My entire life felt condensed into the quiet ticking of the second hand on my watch. At 8:45 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Evelyn. "Server is on site." I felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline so potent it was almost nauseating. The machine was in motion. At 9:06 a.m., the phone buzzed again. "Package delivered. Signed for by Arthur Vance's personal assistant." "Good morning, Alara." I read the text 3 times. A strange calm washed over me, the kind that follows a lightning strike. The world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen. I had simply thrown a rock into a placid pond, and now I had to wait for the ripples. The ripples arrived faster than I expected. At 9:37 a.m., my personal cell phone, the one I had kept for just this eventuality, lit up with Arthur's name. I took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and answered on the 3rd ring. "Ellie," he said. His voice was laced with a weary, patronizing impatience, the tone a father might use for a child throwing a tantrum. "I've just received a very bizarre and frankly unprofessional document from some high-priced legal sharks. What in God's name is this nonsense?" I kept my voice perfectly level, a placid lake of calm. "It's exactly what it says it is, Arthur. It's a legal notice of non-renewal for the commercial lease at 54th and Lexington." He laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "Don't be ridiculous. The company holds the lease on that building. It has for 50 years. Vance & Co. is the tenant, yes," I corrected him gently. "The landlord, as of April, is the Alamand Holding Corp., of which I am the sole director. The current lease expires on December 31st. I'm simply informing you, as is my legal right, that I will not be renewing it under its current terms." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, the condescension giving way to a flicker of genuine confusion. "What are you talking about? Alamand Holding? What is this, some kind of pathetic shakedown? If you're trying to get a bigger settlement out of us, this is a profoundly childish and ill-conceived way to do it. Just sign the papers I sent you, Ellie. Stop making this harder than it needs to be." "This has nothing to do with a settlement," I said, my voice as cool and clear as the glass on his desk. "This is a property matter. I own the building, and Vance & Co.'s tenancy is ending. I'd suggest you have your lawyers look at the public property records for the deed. Then have them contact my counsel, Evelyn Reed. Her details are on the notice. Goodbye, Arthur." I hung up before he could respond. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hand was perfectly steady. I had drawn first blood, not with a scream, but with a fact. It was far more devastating. For the next 2 hours, there was silence. I pictured the frantic storm I had unleashed. Arthur, red-faced and sputtering, demanding his legal team get to the bottom of it. The lawyers, confident at first, then scrambling as they pulled the city records. I could imagine the phone call, the dawning horror in their voices as they told him the truth. "She's not lying, Mr. Vance. The deed was transferred to this holding company upon her father's death. The building is hers." The foundation of their world, which they had assumed was solid granite, had just turned to sand. At 11:42 a.m., the phone rang again. This time I let it go to voicemail. I needed to hear their initial, unfiltered rage before I engaged again. The message left was a minute of pure, sputtering fury from Arthur, with Leo shouting in the background. It was barely coherent. "You backstabbing little! How dare you! This is a family asset. Illegal, we will sue you into the Stone Age." It was exactly what Evelyn had predicted. Noise and fury, signifying nothing. An hour later, Arthur called back. This time I answered. His voice was no longer condescending. It was a raw, guttural roar. "What do you think you're doing?" he bellowed, so loud I had to pull the phone from my ear. "I'm managing my property," I said calmly. "Your property?" Leo's voice cut in, shrill and incredulous. He must have been on speakerphone. "You stole that building. Dad built that company with Richard." "Grandfather and my father built that company," I corrected him. "And my father bought the building with his own money. He was a meticulous man. I'm sure your lawyers have confirmed that by now." "This is a betrayal of your father's memory," Arthur shouted. "He would be spinning in his grave to see you trying to destroy this family, to destroy his life's work over a childish grudge." The accusation was so galling, so profoundly hypocritical, that a cold, pure anger cut through my forced calm. "You want to talk about my father's memory?" I asked, my voice dropping low and dangerous. "You want to talk about betrayal? You sat in his chair and you used my grief as an excuse to steal my birthright. You threw me out of my own home with a condescending smile and told me I was too emotional to run a business. You have no right to speak his name to me. You are tenants. And your lease is up. Direct any further communication to my lawyer." I hung up again, my whole body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. They had tried to attack me, to bully me, and for the first time I had not only stood my ground, I had thrown their accusations back in their faces. I was no longer their victim. I was their adversary. The final call of the day came in the late afternoon. It was Catherine. Her voice was thick with tears. "Ellie, oh, Ellie, please, what are you doing?" The manufactured emotion, the pleading tone that I had once found comforting, now sounded hollow and manipulative. "I'm securing my inheritance, Catherine." "But this isn't the way," she cried. "You're tearing the family apart. Arthur is, I've never seen him so angry. Leo is threatening all sorts of terrible things. This isn't you. Your father would have wanted peace. He would have wanted us to be a family." The mention of my father from her was the final straw. She, who had sat by and watched them dismantle his legacy, who had given them the power to oust his own daughter with her proxy vote, was now appealing to his memory. "Let me be very clear, Catherine," I said, and the ice in my own voice surprised me. "The time for us to be a family was in that boardroom. You had a choice. You could have stood up for what Richard wanted, for what you knew was right. But you chose to side with them. You chose your own security over his memory and his daughter. You made a business decision. Well, now I am making a business decision. You are all tenants in my building, and your lease will not be renewed. It is that simple." "But where will we go, the business?" she stammered. "That sounds like a problem for the CEO and the COO of Vance & Co., I said flatly. "I'm sure they have a contingency plan. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm very busy. As I told Arthur and Leo, from now on, all communication goes through Evelyn Reed." I ended the call before she could dissolve into another round of sobs. I finally switched the phone off and dropped it into my desk drawer. The barrage was over. The first wave of their shock, rage, and manipulation had crashed against my defenses, and the wall had held. I felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, but beneath it, something else was stirring, a quiet, humming sense of power. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window as the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the city in hues of orange and gold. They had underestimated me. They had seen a grieving daughter, a fragile woman, an emotional liability. They had failed to see the one thing my father had always known was there, the steel core he had so carefully forged. They had started a war when they kicked me out of my home. Today, I had simply returned fire from a fortress they never knew existed. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since my father died, I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to win. The weeks following the declaration of war settled into a tense, thrumming quiet. The angry phone calls ceased, replaced by the cold, formal language of legal correspondence. All communication was filtered through Evelyn Reed, turning the raw, familial conflict into a strategic chess match played by high-priced attorneys. My life became a series of updates, of reviewed motions and countersuits. I was no longer just a daughter seeking vengeance. I was the client, the director, the silent, implacable force behind a legal siege engine. As Evelyn had predicted, Arthur's first move was a clumsy, furious assault in the courts. His lawyers filed a lawsuit brimming with righteous indignation, accusing me of everything from fraudulent conveyance of the property to exerting undue influence on my father from his deathbed. They petitioned for an emergency injunction to halt the non-renewal of the lease, arguing that the building was an inseparable asset of Vance & Co., essential to its survival. My first time seeing them since the boardroom was at the preliminary hearing. The courtroom was paneled in dark, imposing wood, a fitting stage for the drama. I sat beside Evelyn, my back straight, my hands resting calmly on the table before me. Across the aisle, Arthur, Leo, and Catherine sat with their legal team. They looked smaller in this neutral territory, stripped of the power of the boardroom. Arthur's face was puffy and mottled with anger. Leo fidgeted, his usual smirk replaced by a sullen pout. Catherine looked pale and terrified, her eyes darting everywhere but at me. They were a portrait of entitled outrage, unable to comprehend a world that didn't bend to their will. Their lawyer, a slick man with a booming voice, argued passionately about legacy, family, and corporate stability. He painted me as a vengeful, irrational daughter, driven by grief and spite to destroy the company her father loved. When he finished, the air was thick with his manufactured drama. Then Evelyn rose. She spoke in a calm, measured voice, dismantling his entire argument not with emotion, but with a mountain of evidence. She presented the deed, the trust documents, the articles of incorporation for the Alamand Holding Corp., and then the masterstroke. She produced copies of 20 years' worth of rent checks, drawn from Vance & Co.'s account and made payable to Alamand Holding, each one co-signed by my father, and for the past decade, by Arthur himself. "For 10 years, Your Honor," Evelyn stated, her voice cutting through the silence. "Mr. Vance has been co-signing checks to a landlord he now claims doesn't exist. He claims this building is a corporate asset, yet for a decade he has explicitly authorized payments to an outside entity for its use. Either he was willfully ignorant of his own company's finances, or he is being less than truthful with this court. Which is it, Mr. Vance?" Arthur's face went from red to ashen. The judge, a stern, impatient woman, peered over her glasses at their legal team. "Do you have any actual evidence to support your claims?" she asked, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Or are we just here to publicly litigate a family squabble?" The injunction was denied. It was a swift, brutal legal blow that legitimized my position and exposed theirs as baseless. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright autumn afternoon, and for the first time I allowed myself a small, tight smile. The law was on my side. The facts were on my side, and their arrogance was my greatest ally. Chastened and cornered, Arthur was forced to the negotiating table. He still believed he was in control, that this was a temporary setback. Through his lawyers, he demanded a meeting to discuss the terms of a new lease. He thought he could bully me on the numbers, that my emotional female brain wouldn't be able to handle a tough business negotiation. He had no idea I had been preparing for this for months. Evelyn and I didn't grant them a meeting. We simply sent our response, a draft of the new lease agreement. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of malicious compliance. Every clause was legally sound, based on the aggressive market analysis I'd commissioned, and every word was a turn of the screw. The rent was increased by 250%, bringing it to the full, blistering market rate for a prime piece of midtown real estate. The term was for 1 year, not 5, with no option to renew guaranteed. It was a triple net lease, which meant Vance & Co. would now be responsible for every single cost associated with the building. Property taxes, insurance, structural maintenance, down to changing the light bulbs in the lobby. We demanded a security deposit equal to 6 months of the new, exorbitant rent, due upon signing. And the final, most poisonous dart, a personal guarantee clause. Arthur and Leo would have to sign as individuals, making their personal assets, their homes, their cars, their investment portfolios, collateral if the company defaulted. We sent the document and waited. We were offering them a path to survival that was, in reality, a cliff's edge. I received updates on the fallout from an unexpected source. Mr. Abramov, the elderly, bearded head of our violin workshop and a man who had worked with my father for 40 years, sent me a discreet email. He was a man of few words, but his descriptions painted a vivid picture of the chaos inside my father's company. "They are panicking," he wrote. "Mr. Arthur screams in his office. Mr. Leo blames everyone. To pay the lawyers, they have laid off 3 of our best finishers. They are sourcing cheaper spruce from a new supplier in China. It is stiff, it has no voice. They are demanding we increase output by 20%, rushing the varnishing process. The instruments we are making now, Richard would not have put his name on them." His words were a knife in my heart. Laying off craftsmen, using inferior wood. This was the very sacrilege my father had fought against his entire life. The business I was squeezing wasn't just Arthur and Leo's cash cow. It was Mr. Abramov's life, the legacy of dozens of artisans. A wave of doubt, cold and sickening, washed over me. In my quest to punish the guilty, was I destroying the innocent? Was I becoming the very thing I despised? Someone who saw Vance & Co. as a tool, a means to an end, rather than a living, breathing cathedral of craft. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked to the glass case where I kept the last violin my father ever finished, an instrument he had made for me. I took it out, its varnish glowing like honey in the dim light. I could feel his hands in the perfect balance, his soul in the flawless curves. Was I destroying all of this? I called Evelyn at home, a thing I had never done before. "Am I doing the right thing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The company, the craft, it's falling apart." Evelyn was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost its lawyerly edge and was just the voice of a sharp, clear-thinking woman. "Ilara, what you're describing was happening anyway, just more slowly. Men like your uncle and cousin see a legacy as something to be strip-mined, not cultivated. They were already cutting corners, you told me so yourself. All you've done is accelerate the process. The business you loved died with your father. The thing that exists in that building now is just a parasite living in its corpse. You are not destroying your father's legacy. You are fumigating his house." Her words were harsh, but they rang with a terrible truth. The Vance & Co. that existed today was already a perversion. Arthur and Leo were the ones sacrificing quality, laying off artisans, dishonoring the name on the door. I wasn't the cause of the rot. I was just the one holding a magnifying glass to it, using financial pressure to reveal the decay that was already there. My resolve hardened once more, the doubt burned away by a renewed, colder clarity. A week later, we received the official response from Arthur's lawyers. It was a furious, multi-page letter, rejecting our proposed lease in its entirety. They called the terms unconscionable, predatory, and demonstrably negotiated in bad faith. It was a tantrum in legalese, a final, desperate roar of defiance. It was also a catastrophic mistake on their part. My phone rang the moment Evelyn received the email. "We've got it," she said, and I could hear the triumphant smile in her voice. A formal, written rejection of our offer. They chose this path. "So what happens now?" I asked, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. "Now," Evelyn said, savoring the words, "they have no current lease and no future lease. They have officially signaled their intent to vacate. We have everything we need. I'm filing the eviction papers in the morning." The final months of the year were a slow, inexorable countdown. The legal machinations continued, but their momentum was gone. Arthur's lawyers filed appeal after appeal, but each was dismissed more quickly than the last. They were no longer fighting a war. They were just thrashing in the net as it was pulled tight. The holidays passed in a surreal blur. I spent Christmas Day alone, eating takeout and staring at the city lights, feeling a strange and lonely sense of anticipation. While the rest of the world was celebrating endings and new beginnings, I was waiting for an execution. The date was set, January 2nd. It was a brutally cold, gray morning. A biting wind swept down the avenues, carrying with it the exhausted melancholy of the day after a celebration. I arrived at 8:00 a.m. sharp, dressed in a black wool coat, my face pale but composed. The scene was already in motion. 2 large, anonymous moving trucks were parked at the curb. A uniformed city marshal, a stoic man with a weary face, was conferring with the foreman of the moving crew. This was not a corporate relocation. It was an eviction. The process was cold, impersonal, and absolute. I stood across the street for a moment, a ghost watching her own history being dismantled. Then I crossed, my heels clicking on the icy pavement. The marshal nodded at me. "Ms. Vance, we're ready to begin." "I'd like to go inside," I said. He simply nodded and gestured toward the great glass doors. The familiar chime as I entered was the only thing that was the same. The lobby was in chaos. Cardboard boxes were everywhere, stacked in precarious towers. The air was thick with the scent of packing tape and dust. And in the middle of it all stood my family. Leo saw me first. His face, already blotchy with stress and lack of sleep, contorted into a mask of pure hatred. He stormed toward me, jabbing a finger in my face. "You actually showed up," he spat, his voice cracking with adolescent rage. "You actually have the nerve to come here and watch. I hope you're happy. I hope you're enjoying this, you cold-hearted bitch." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at him, at this boy who had been given everything and had earned nothing, and I felt nothing but a profound emptiness. "This is a legal proceeding, Leo. I have every right to be here. This is my property." "Your property?" he laughed, a hysterical, ugly sound. "You destroyed a 50-year-old company for a piece of property. You've put dozens of people out of work. You've dragged our name through the mud. All for what? So you could have this empty building." "The person who destroyed the company is your father," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "And you helped him." Before he could spew more venom, Arthur appeared, shoving his son aside. He looked 10 years older than he had a few months ago. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was a road map of broken blood vessels, and his eyes held the desperate, wild look of a deposed king. He tried to rein in his fury, to make one last appeal to a logic that no longer existed. "Ellie, stop this," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "It's not too late. Call them off. We can still fix this. Think of your father. Think of what he would say if he could see his family's belongings being thrown out onto the street like common criminals." His use of my father's name was the final spark on the dry tinder of my patience. The calm I had so carefully constructed fell away, not in a firestorm of rage, but in a wave of glacial cold. I took a step closer to him, forcing him to meet my gaze. "My father," I began, my voice low but carrying with it the weight of every betrayal, every sleepless night, every ounce of pain I had endured, "would be ashamed of you, Arthur. He would be horrified. He built this business on a foundation of integrity, quality, and respect. A foundation you and your son systematically dismantled the moment he was gone. You started using cheaper wood. You laid off the master craftsmen who were the very soul of this company. You bled it dry to finance your own egos." I saw a flicker of shock in his eyes. He had no idea I knew. "You want to talk about family?" I continued, my voice gaining strength. "You invoked the word family in that boardroom when you sat in my father's chair and told his daughter, a week after she had buried him, that she was too emotional to lead. You didn't just fire me. You tried to erase me from my own life, from my father's legacy. You used my grief, the deepest pain I have ever known, as a corporate strategy. You have the audacity to stand here, among the ruins of your own making, and lecture me on family." I gestured around at the chaotic scene, at the movers efficiently and impersonally wrapping desks in plastic. "This isn't a tragedy. This is a consequence. You are not being thrown onto the street. You are being professionally removed from a property you have no legal right to occupy, a property you failed to secure because you were too arrogant to negotiate and too incompetent to afford. You were tenants. Your lease expired. You did this to yourselves." A stunning silence fell over the lobby. Leo was speechless, his jaw slack. Arthur stared at me, his face collapsing as the last of his bluster drained away, leaving only the hollow shell of a defeated man. In the corner, I saw Catherine weeping silently into a handkerchief, a spectator to a life that had completely unraveled. There was nothing left to say. My truth, the one I had held inside me for nearly a year, had finally been spoken. I stepped back, my role in the confrontation over. I became a silent observer, watching as the movers systematically disassembled their reign. I watched them take Arthur's oversized mahogany desk, the one he'd bought to replace my father's. I watched them take down the garish, abstract paintings he had hung in place of the beautiful black-and-white photographs of luthiers at work. I watched them box up files, computers, and the cheap, mass-produced awards they'd bought for themselves. It was the methodical, passionless undoing of a great wrong. By late afternoon, it was over. The last truck was loaded. Arthur, Leo, and Catherine left without another word, their shoulders slumped in defeat, swallowed by the uncaring city. The marshal did a final walkthrough, then came to me in the vast, empty lobby. He handed me a single key. "It's all yours, Ms. Vance." He left, and the great glass doors clicked shut behind him, leaving me in profound and absolute silence. It was the same sound I'd heard the day they threw me out, but this time it meant something entirely different. It was the sound of reclamation. I walked through the empty building, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous spaces. The executive offices were stripped bare, with pale squares on the walls where pictures used to hang. The showroom, once a forest of gleaming cellos and violins, was a vast, empty expanse of polished wood flooring. I went down to the workshop. The workbenches were clear, but the scent was still there, fainter now but unmistakable. Lemon oil, spruce, maple, and thyme. The soul of the place was still here, buried beneath the dust. It had been waiting. I ended my tour in the center of the showroom, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the darkening winter sky. The victory was total. The revenge was complete. The sense of justice was a solid, tangible thing inside my chest, but it wasn't a jubilant feeling. It was a quiet, somber satisfaction, the feeling of a surgeon who has just completed a long and difficult operation to remove a sickness. The cancer was gone. The house was clean. I had won. I had taken back my father's foundation. I stood there alone, surrounded by the ghosts of what had been and the infinite, terrifying possibility of what could come next. The real work was about to begin. The first few months of my ownership were spent in silence and dust. The building, once the center of my universe, was now a 7-story monument to my victory, and it felt haunted. I hired architects and engineers to assess its bones, to map out its potential, but I resisted any real plans. The silence was a necessary palate cleanser, a way to strip the space of the lingering bitterness of the past. The victory had been absolute, but it had been an act of demolition. I had torn down the corrupted house my uncle had built, but now I stood in the rubble, and the question of what to build in its place was a far more daunting challenge. Evelyn, ever the pragmatist, saw the building as a solved equation. It was a prime piece of Manhattan real estate, an asset to be leveraged. She brought me offers that were staggering in their audacity. A global investment bank wanted to lease the entire building for 20 years, turning the workshop into a trading floor and the showroom into a cavernous lobby of marble and glass. A tech giant offered to buy it outright for a sum that would have allowed me to disappear onto a private island and never think about the word violin again. The offers were tempting. They represented a clean, simple end to the story. Take the money, walk away, and leave the ghosts behind for someone else to exorcise. It was the sensible, logical path. But one afternoon, as I stood in the empty, dust-mote-filled air of the main workshop, I ran my hand over the deep grooves and nicks in my father's old workbench. This was the heart of the building, the place where beauty had been born from raw material. To let it become a trading floor felt like a final, unforgivable betrayal, not of my father, but of myself and the principles he had instilled in me. My fight hadn't just been about owning the bricks and mortar. It had been about honoring the soul of the work that was done within them. I called Evelyn and told her to reject all the offers. The building was not for sale. It was not for lease. It was for me. My vision was not to resurrect Vance, and Co. That name was tainted now. a brand my uncle and cousin had run into the ground. A notice in a trade journal mentioned they had attempted to relaunch out of a soulless industrial park in New Jersey, but the venture had collapsed in less than 6 months amidst rumors of shoddy craftsmanship and canceled orders. They were a footnote now. My vision was for something new, something truer. I would create a workshop that embodied the original spirit of my father's work, focused not on volume or profit margins, but on unparalleled, uncompromising quality. I would call it, simply, the Vance Workshop. My first and most important task was not to hire contractors, but to rebuild a family of artisans. I tracked down Mr. Abramov. I found him living in a small apartment in Queens, retired and disillusioned. I invited him for coffee, and with him came 2 of the other master craftsmen Arthur had fired. They were wary, their eyes holding the guarded pain of men who had given their lives to a craft only to be discarded. I didn't give them a corporate pitch. I sat with them in a small, quiet cafe and I told them my story and my dream. "I'm not offering you jobs," I said, looking each of them in the eye. "I'm offering you a home. I want to build a workshop that operates as a true partnership, a place where the luthiers are the most important people in the building, not the accountants. A place where there are no compromises on materials, no rushing the process. We will make fewer instruments, but they will be the finest in the world. And you won't just be employees. I'm offering you equity, a share in what we build together." I saw the flicker of disbelief in their eyes give way to a dawning hope. Mr. Abramov, after a long silence, leaned forward, his gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Your father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He always said the wood has a spirit, that our job is just to let it sing. The last few years, they forgot that. They were just making boxes. If you want to let the wood sing again, Alara, then I will come home." And so the building came back to life. Spring arrived, and with it the sounds of careful creation returned. The workshop was redesigned, not for efficiency, but for the artisans. Natural light flooded the space. The finest tools were brought in. We sourced a stock of rare, aged tonewood, maple, spruce, and ebony that my father would have wept to see. Mr. Abramov took his place at his old bench, and soon the air was once again filled with the scent of wood shavings and the gentle sound of planes and chisels. I was not the aloof owner in an office upstairs. I was there, on the floor, every day, learning from them, my hands covered in varnish and dust, just as I had been as a girl. I had not only reclaimed my building, I had reclaimed my life. A year to the day after the eviction, we held our quiet opening. We didn't invite the press or the industry bigwigs. We invited musicians. In the newly finished showroom, which was now warm, intimate, and acoustically perfect, a brilliant young cellist from Juilliard played the very first instrument to bear the mark of the Vance Workshop. It was a cello that Mr. Abramov had spent 6 months creating. As the first notes of a Bach suite filled the room, the sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was rich, deep, and resonant, a sound of such profound beauty that it brought tears to my eyes. It was the sound of a legacy not just restored, but reborn. It was the sound of pain being transformed into art. I stood in the back of the room, watching the faces of the musicians, seeing their rapt attention, their reverence for the sound. Evelyn stood beside me, her usually stern face softened by a rare, genuine smile. Arthur, I had heard, was living in Florida in a state of forced, bitter retirement. Leo was reportedly selling luxury cars in Connecticut. They were ghosts, echoes from a different life. My revenge on them was not that I had taken their building. It was that I was thriving without them. I had proven them wrong. The music swelled, a testament to resilience, to craft, to the enduring spirit of a father's love and a daughter's will. The eviction had been a necessary, brutal act of clearing the ground. But this was the true victory. It was not in the silence of an empty building, but in the glorious, vibrant sound that now filled it. It was the sound of my own voice, finally singing free.